In 1937, Janos was elected King of the Gypsies in Poland, and in a stadium filled with people he announced, "I will send a delegate to Mussolini, asking him to grant us a strip of land in Abyssinia for the settlement of the Gypsy race. Our people have had enough of wandering through the ages. The time now has come for our nomad life to cease. We will soon have our representative in the League of Nations." This was part of a push to create a homeland for the Romani people in the early 20th century, very similar to Zionism. The two movements in fact had quite a few similarities. Both groups were persecuted in their homeland, they would host international conferences to unite their people, and they would both seek foreign support. Plus, in the early 20th century, there was still some debate as to where a homeland should be. For instance, in the case of Zionism, some Christian leaders wanted to make a Jewish state in Madagascar, British Guyana, or even Uganda. And the same was true for the Romani. They hoped to have a homeland, but where this homeland should be was open to debate. It could have been Abyssinia, or some believed that they came from India, so somewhere on the Ganges would be best, and then South Africa and even Egypt became a popular choice. And on Abyssinia, Mussolini also seems to have looked into creating a Jewish state there as well, so these two movements were often intertwined. To start off though, I think it's important to stress just how bad the Romani communities were persecuted in previous centuries, and in many cases still are today. For instance, in Tudor England they were banned from the country, although many remained, and anyone found associating with them would be executed. It was in this climate that they began to appoint their own kings. However, finding reliable sources can be a little bit tricky. For instance, men like Jenkin Cowdiddle apparently had 300 soldiers and fought in the Battle of Gypsy, but he was also allegedly a man who was known for his drunkenness and swearing. Then there's Cock Laurel, who apparently created a secret language known as Thieves' Cant, organised the community into thieving fraternities similar to guilds, and was described as one of the most notorious knaves that ever lived. However, his name alone just means the leader of the rascals, so like with Jenkin Cowdiddle, it's hard to know whether this was a completely mythical man, or if he was based on a real leader of the Romani, or was in fact a proud thief. Also, at this time, many people believed that they came from Egypt, so they were often called the kings of the Egyptians. This was especially true up in Scotland, when a sort of dynasty of kings emerged. This was the Farr dynasty, which began when John Farr began to work with the local sheriffs in the 16th century. The Farr family continued to play a prominent role in Romani politics until the 19th century in order to enforce what was called the laws of Egypt. So in this case they were seen as beneficial to the central government, as they would bring a community that would otherwise be beyond their control into the fold. Keep this in mind for later on, as it'll be important in early 20th century Poland. Otherwise, the persecution of the Romani was particularly bad out in Eastern Europe, where they essentially became slaves on their arrival. In fact, the first Romani in Romania was said to have been brought back by Vlad Dracul, the father of Vlad the Impaler. After campaigning against the Ottomans, he brought back 11 to 12,000 persons, without luggage and animal, who looked like Egyptians. So they were brought back as slaves and often handed out to the nobility and even monasteries back in the 15th century. His son Vlad the Impaler obviously carried on this persecution, and according to one story, he invited them to a festival, made them all drunk and threw them into the fire. Another amusement of his was the construction of an enormous cauldron, into which he thrust his victims. This persecution and enslavement continued for centuries. Many of the slaves would be castrated, they'd be bought and sold like other forms of chattel slavery, and any non-Romani man who had relations with a Romani would in turn have to become a slave. Even as late as 1834, Barbu Sturbai recorded one of the slave auctions that still took place. Passers-by quickened their steps and lowered their eyes, so that they don't have to look at the men and women tearing at their rags in anguish. Devilish dark skin, these are gypsies. You can't escape the entreaties of the mothers whose children are being torn away from them, nor their sobs and screams of fear, nor their curses. You can't escape the cracking of whips breaking down their stubborn resistance to the separation inevitably to come. In fact, when the Austrians took over parts of modern-day Romania in the 18th century, they were shocked to find out how the slave owners would so openly whip and beat their slaves. A couple years later, Mikhail Kogelnichainu wrote they had iron clamps around their foreheads and metal collars about their necks. Cruel beatings and other punishments such as starvation, being hung over smoking fires, solitary imprisonment, and being thrown naked into the snow or frozen rivers. Such was the fate of the wretched Gypsy. Mikhail would later play an important role in the abolition movement, but afterwards there was quite a large effort to forcibly assimilate them. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the First World War brought about a great shift in Romani politics. That's not to say there weren't great shifts beforehand. For instance, industrialization caused a lot of economic problems for the Romani and their more traditional jobs, but this war changed a great deal. For instance, over in the new Soviet Union, the All-Russia Gypsy Union was set up. This was part of the Soviets' initial attempts to push for different nationalities having their own written languages, representation and the likes. But I'm sure many of you know it didn't last particularly long, as the Soviets reversed this policy and tried to forcibly assimilate the different nationalities in the 1930s. Otherwise, new nations like Poland were either reborn or created, and as for Romania, they annexed Transylvania. This brought tens of thousands of Romani from Austro-Hungarian control into the Romanian state, and almost instantly, there were large Romani gatherings, and this is when George Lazurica came to prominence. He got involved with the General Union of Romanian Gypsies, or the UGRR, and through his writing and a little political sabotage, he rose to become its leader. In 1934, he organized an international congress for all Romani people, with the goal to organize themselves into a race-conscious and stable community, or, in essence, unite into one nation. Plus, I should also add, although I'm focusing on Eastern Europe, there were similar groups in the West. For instance, George worked with the Gypsy Law Society in England. Together they published books on Romani mythology, created their own newspapers, and even made their own flag. Then Romani associations from America and Britain began to look into the idea that they came from India, and, allegedly, George was keen on sending over an expedition out east in order to find their homeland and create a Palestine of their own. So around 1934 to 1935, he began to call himself the President of the Romanese Republic, but there was still obviously disagreements about where they initially came from. Even George started to believe that they came from an Egyptian tribe. Then, in 1937, he started publishing articles saying that they were in fact Bactrians who continued the nomadic lifestyle while the Brahmin in India settled down in cities. They were then pushed west by the Mongols, split into different tribes, and found their way into Europe, somehow via Egypt. It was a complicated set of pseudo-historical beliefs, which made creating a nation even more difficult. But George would eventually fall from power as splits in the UGRR began to emerge. There were many causes behind these splits, like tribalism or even religion. For instance, many of them accepted the Orthodox Church, but some began to flirt with the idea of accepting the Greek Church or even Catholicism. George was then ousted by the Niculescu brothers, who beat him into signing a confession, apparently admitting that he wasn't Romani at all. Now, George, and especially the Niculescu brothers, are controversial figures today, because they largely accepted fascism and anti-Semitism. For instance, at one congress in Bucharest, the Niculescu brothers hung huge portraits of Hitler in the hall. Both George and the brothers began publishing very anti-Semitic articles. George apparently copied a lot of Hitler's mannerisms, and both would form alliances with the Iron Guard, the fascists that would eventually take over Romania. Yet George and the likes had met with Romani people across Europe, especially in the east, and these congresses were held as far away as Kaunas in Lithuania. But had he been successful and created a homeland for the Romani people, he would have had challenges for leadership from the Kwiek family in Poland. This family was originally Romanian but emigrated to Poland, where the idea of king of the Gypsies was more widely accepted. After all, through a king, the Romani population would now be policed and become taxable citizens. So after Poland achieved their independence, the new government recognized Gregory Kwiek as king of the Gypsies, and he ruled until 1930, when he resigned due to old age. His son Michael took over, and he had some pretty bold plans, like creating Romani schools, gymnasiums, and even factories to provide employment. He was in fact actually able to build one of these factories in Poznan and hired a few hundred people. But he would also police the Romani, so of course the government was happy to promote his cause. In terms of policing, they had their own tribunal, had the right to arrest people for minor crimes, and had a few independent policemen in Romani camps and the likes. But Michael didn't come to the throne easily. This was an elected monarchy, and there were a couple of claimants, all from the Kwiek family, like Andrei and Vasil. Michael had to organize a gathering of Romani leaders to settle the issue and prevent what could have been a sort of civil war. During the meeting, he managed to get the two other claimants to stand down, while he agreed to rule for a set term of 5 years. Before becoming king, Michael had travelled around Europe, and during his reign he continued to do so. In Romania he spoke to huge crowds, he then met with Romani leaders in Spain, Portugal and other nations, and, all the while, pushed for the creation of a nation in India. However, like the leaders in Romania, he too had some conflicting ideas of where the homeland should be. For instance, in London, he spoke at Hyde Park and was adamant that the British should hand them land in Africa. Like a few Romani leaders, he had set his eyes on South Africa as well, but whether he preferred South Africa or India, it's hard to tell. Michael, according to some Polish newspapers, also brought communism into the Romani communities in Poland, Romania and Czechoslovakia. In fact, when speaking in Czechoslovakia, he was banned from the country, and he was ousted as king in 1934. Matthias Kwiek took over, but he gave up the title of king, saying that he was loyal to the Polish government and no king should exist in that country. But Mateusz wasn't even Polish. He was born in Spain and allegedly met with Franco. But even if he didn't meet the man, he was a great supporter, and was even buried with a photo of Franco showing another Romani leader was a supporter of a fascist ruler. And by the way, Mateusz was killed in a family feud in 1937, again causing a succession crisis. Some people just went ahead and proclaimed themselves to be king of the Gypsies, like Joseph Kwiek, and he too had some bold plans for a homeland. Initially he wanted one to be created in eastern Poland or modern-day Belarus, but when this seemed unachievable, he set his eyes on Africa. He sent a delegation to the League of Nations, and there, they asked the British for the right to form a homeland in South Africa, but obviously nothing came of this, and he was never crowned king officially. Instead, Janos Kwiek became the official king, and his election and coronation was a grand event. In the words of one reporter, "We have witnessed an act of choosing the ruler of the kingdom, the strangest of all kingdoms in the world, without land, without capital, without castles and palaces, with subjects scattered all over Europe, the kingdom of the Gypsies. They have said to themselves, 'Enough of this vagrant, miserable nomadic life under the stars. We have had enough of being called lazybodies and gypsies. We want to have our own state. We want a king who would provide for our needs. The king, a genuine king, in a golden crown, scepter in hand, crowned solemnly last Sunday at the Polish Army Stadium in Warsaw, in the presence of several thousand spectators, with the crowning ceremony filmed and reported by radio stations around the world. There were 5 candidates for the throne, all of them from the Kwiek family. The election was carried out by 30 Gypsy senators, including representatives of Romanian, Hungarian, Portuguese and Spanish Gypsies. The reporter then proceeds to mock the throne, the use of firecrackers and the likes. The bishop then put a robe over the new king, which had the fleur-de-lis on, and announced, "May the election of this king unite the Gypsy race throughout the world, and strengthen their social, moral and family foundations. And may they be true to the Polish Republic, which, in giving permission for this coronation of a king of the Gypsies, has shown its regard for the whole race." This is when Janos gives his speech that was said at the beginning of the video, saying that he would ask Mussolini for land in Abyssinia. But this coronation did not unite the Romani cause. Even the Kwiek family remained divided. There was, after all, another claimant named Basil, and he even named a chancellor, his brother Rudolf. Rudolf would give interviews to journalists and came up with some pretty bold and often incorrect statements. For instance, he said that Basil was the king of the Gypsies in Poland, while Janos was an emperor, or a king of kings who lived in London. For instance, when a reporter asked Rudolf how they would fund their bold plans, he said, "Kings are rich. Janos is the richest in London and he supports us. Now, for example, he sent money to build the palace for King Basil." As for his plans for a new nation, Rudolf said, "Gypsies once ruled over the world, a powerful ancient state. Egypt used to belong to them. Pharaoh, this was our supreme czar and ruler. There were 2 greatest leaders in the world back then, Jewish Moses and Gypsy Pharaoh. They fought with each other, but Jews, just like today, had more education compared to Gypsies and won. When Moses was leading Jews out of Egypt and they crossed the Black Sea, the Gypsy army was flooded. Some, however, survived. They were scattered around the world and they wander to this day." So there's quite a lot to unpack in some of these statements. For instance, he made the mistake of saying the Black Sea and not the Red Sea, and you can also see some of the anti-Semitism here that was also prevalent in Romania. And, chiefly, there's the bold claim that they were ancient Egyptians, specifically Pharaoh's soldiers chasing Moses. But Rudolf and his king Basil were keen on this idea of creating a homeland in Egypt, and even wanted to create their own alphabet similar to hieroglyphics. Again, in Rudolph's words, "We want to return to our homeland and create our state. We want us to be granted Egypt or another country in Africa. Just a few months ago, I was in Africa to investigate on the ground the possibilities of Gypsy colonization. Whether or not he actually went to Africa, I can't verify. But again, these disjointed efforts came to nothing, and, tragically, the Nazis in neighbouring Germany were coming up with plans of extermination. Anti-Romani laws actually existed in Germany before the Nazis came to power. For instance, the Weimar leadership banned them from moving around and forced them to carry ID cards. Arbitrary arrests harassed the communities in the 1920s, but it of course got a lot worse in the 1930s, and when the Nazis invaded Poland and other countries, many of the Romani were killed. Previous kings of the Gypsies had tried to record how many Romani lived in each country, but all efforts failed, and this makes it near impossible to know how many were killed in the Holocaust, with numbers ranging from 150,000 to 1.5 million. After the war, the State of Israel was created, but as you know, nothing was given to the Romani people. However, the dreams of a Romani homeland have not ended, and still, in some countries, they continue to push for it through their elected leaders. And this brings me to my question today. Do you know of any other strange countries that could have existed? One that comes to mind for me is British plans to create a Native American buffer state between their colonies in Canada and the United States. But do you know of any stranger ones? Leave yours in the comments below.